Hello students, welcome to all of you. This is the third video on the chapter 5 and the name of the chapter is pollination. Okay students, in the last video, or we can say the second part of this chapter, we have done the exercise for revision. In this video I'm going to start with the topic pollination. Students, I have explained you the types of flowers and the parts of flowers. In the types of flowers, I have told you there are two types of flowers, monosexual and bisexual. Also, I have told you there are four main parts of a flower: calyx, corolla, androecium, and gynoecium. In this chapter, in this part, we are going to start with the topic pollination. Okay. Now, what is pollination? The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is called pollination. A very simple definition. Now look at this. Now we just understand what the pollination is. I have told you that in a flower there is a male reproductive part which is called anther. In anther, okay, I have told you the upper part is called what? This lower part is called filament, okay, and this part is called, so this part is called anther. Okay students, this part is anther, and I have told you that pollen grains are present on the surface of the anther. What are pollen grains? Pollen grains are the powdery structure, powder like structure, which consist male reproductive cells. Okay, so what happens that when these pollen grains transfer from the anther to the stigma. Now, what is a stigma? If you remember, stigma is the female reproductive part of a flower. I have told you, and the upper portion is called style. Sorry, the upper portion is called stigma. Okay, stigma. When these pollen grains transfer from anther to the stigma, this process is called what? Pollination. Again, I'm just repeating this. The transfer of pollen grains, the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of a flower is called pollination. Okay, we know that the pollen grains contain the male reproductive cells and ovules containing the female reproductive cells. Both male and female reproductive cells should come with contact with each other for the formation of seed. So when pollen grain comes with the contact of stigma, then what happens? The formation of seed occurs. Then they come in contact by the process of pollination. Thus, pollination is important for plants as it helps in production of what? In production of fruit and seed. Okay, so pollination is a very important process, because without pollination any flower, any fruit or any seed cannot be formed. Okay, now process of pollination. When the anther matures, then they burst open, the pollen grain fall on the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. The pollen grains also get carried to stigma of a flower of another plant of the same kind. Okay. Now students, The pollen grains also get carried to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same kind. So students, the pollen grains are transferred through wind, water or insect. They are called agents of pollination. Now what are agents of pollination? Agent of pollinations are the agent by which the pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma. Okay, and these are wind, water or insects. For example, many insects such as bees, butterflies feed on the nectar of flowers. They are attracted by the color of fragrance of the flowers. When these insects visit the flowers, the pollen grain from the anther stick to their bodies. When these insects sit on the other flower, these pollen grains get rubbed off on the stigma of that flower. Basically, what happens when any insect sit on the anther, the pollen grain then stick on the body of insect, and when this insect sits on any other flower, then this pollen grain stick to the stigma of that flower. In this way the pollen grain gets transferred. Okay, and this process of pollination occurs. Now the types of pollination. So there are two types of pollination: self pollination and cross pollination. Self pollination is what? When the when the pollen grains are transferred from one flower to the stigma of the another flower of the same plant. This process is called self pollination. On the other hand, when the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of another flower of the another plant, then it is called cross pollination. For example, if the pollen grains of this flower are being transferred to this flower, but both the flower are of the same plant, then this is called self pollination. But if the pollen grains are being transferred to the flower of another plant, as you can see here that this plant, the pollen grains are being transferred from this plant to this plant, then this process is called self pollination, cross pollination. Okay, now students, let us understand more what is self pollination. When pollen grains are transferred from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower or another flower born on the same plant, it is called self pollination. Example, pollination in pea. Okay, and what is cross pollination? When pollen grains are transferred from the anther of a flower of one plant to the stigma of a flower of another plant is called cross pollination. For example, pollination in rose, grass, wheat, corn. Now students, here comes exercise for revision. This exercise you have to do in your copy. Okay, so fill in the blanks. Question 1. The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma, of a flower is called, so what is this process called? Pollination in reproduction. So we have studied now that this process is called pollination. Okay, now second, when insect visit flowers, the dash from anther stick to their bodies. So what substance is called which stick on the body of an insect? That substance is called eggs or pollen grains. Yes, they are called pollen grains. Pollen grains. Fine. 3. Pollination in pea is what? Self pollination or cross pollination? So we have studied here that pollination in pea is called self pollination. Self pollination. Okay, and pollination in grass and wheat is called cross pollination. Okay students, so this is all for today. I will meet you in the fourth part of this chapter. Till then, goodbye.